The contract was written in smudged ink on yellowed paper, signed by a man who called himself her father, and it had owned Rose Prescott for 3 years before a stranger with quiet eyes and calloused hands walked into the Belmore trading post and changed everything she thought she understood about freedom. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat perched on the edge of what most folks called civilization and what others, more honest ones, called chaos. The cattle drives rolled through in great thundering waves, kicking red dust into the air and filling the saloons with men who smelled of trail and spent their wages like the next morning might never come. Caldwell was a border town in every sense, the border between the open Indian Territory to the south and the settled farmlands to the north, the border between lawlessness and the slow creeping reach of order, and the border, too, between the kind of life a person chose and the kind that got chosen for them. Rose Prescott had not chosen hers. She had been 16 years old when her father, a man named Gerald Prescott who had more debts than sense and more whiskey in him than blood, had walked her into the Belmore Trading Post and Trading Company and handed her over to its proprietor, a heavyset man named Clarence Belmore, in exchange for the cancellation of a gambling debt and $40 cash. The contract stipulated 5 years of domestic and labor service. It stipulated room and board provided by the employer. It stipulated wages of $2 a month, most of which Belmore quietly kept for what he called housing fees and supply costs. It did not stipulate kindness. It did not stipulate dignity. It did not stipulate that the girl signing her name to the bottom of the page had any say in the matter at all. By the time Rose turned 19, she had grown accustomed to the particular weight of invisibility. She woke before dawn to light the stoves and heat the water. She scrubbed the plank floors on her knees. She stocked shelves with tins of tobacco and bolts of calico fabric. She served the men who came in off the trail with their muddy boots and their loud laughter and their tendency to look through her as though she were part of the woodwork. She had 2 years left on her contract. She had counted the months. She had counted the days. She had even, in the quiet of the storage room where she slept on a narrow cot behind stacked barrels of flour, counted the hours. The morning Levi Dunlap rode into Caldwell was a Tuesday in early April, and the wind was coming sharp from the north, carrying the smell of rain and new grass and something else Rose could not name, though she would think about it later and decide it had been the smell of change. She was sweeping the front porch of the trading post when she saw him. He rode a dark bay horse, a big steady animal with a white blaze on its nose, and he rode it the way some men rode, not showing off, not slouching, just settled into the saddle like he belonged there, and the horse trusted him completely. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-20s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly under the brim of a worn hat, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that studded the Kansas hills. He wore a plain brown coat and a bandana that had once been blue. He had a rifle in his scabbard and a pistol on his hip, but most men in Caldwell wore guns the way other men wore belts, as practical accessories rather than declarations of intent. He tied his horse at the post outside the trading company and came up the steps, and Rose stepped back to give him room, the way she always did with customers, making herself small and out of the way. He nodded at her as he passed, just a nod. But it was the kind of nod that acknowledged a person, not a piece of furniture, and Rose noticed it the way you notice a small light in a dark room, not blinding but real. She went back to her sweeping. Inside, she could hear Belmore's voice, that oily, pleasant tone he used with customers who might have money. "Welcome, friend. What can I do for you today?" She did not hear what Levi Dunlap said in response. The wind took it. But she heard what happened next, which was a long silence, and then Belmore's voice changing register entirely, losing its warmth like a fire going out, and then the stranger's voice again, low and even, and then another silence that felt different from the first one, heavier, like something was being decided. Rose kept sweeping. She swept the same boards 3 times without realizing it. When Levi came back out onto the porch, he stopped. He looked at her directly, not through her, and said, "Are you Rose Prescott?" She straightened. Her hand tightened on the broom handle. "I am." He took his hat off, which was something men rarely did when they were talking to her, and he held it against his chest, and he said, "My name is Levi Dunlap. I used to ride with a cattle outfit out of Texas, but I've got a spread of my own now, about 20 miles northeast of here, near the Chicaskia River. I came to town today to buy some supplies, and I heard something from the sheriff's deputy this morning that I want to ask you about directly, if that's all right." Rose stared at him. "Ask, then." "The deputy told me you're under a work contract to Belmore, that you've been here since you were 16. He paused. He turned his hat in his hands once. "Is that true?" She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the one she felt whenever someone looked too close at the shape of her life. "It's true. How old are you now?" 19. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I just bought out your contract." The broom nearly slipped from her hands. She caught it. She looked at him and waited for the punchline, for the other side of that sentence, for the part where he told her what he expected in return. He seemed to read her face, because he said it before she could ask. "No conditions, no strings. Belmore had the contract on him. I paid him what it was worth, or what he said it was worth, which I suspect was more than it was actually worth, but that's fine. The contract is settled. You owe nothing to anyone." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. "This is your copy. The debt's cleared. You're free to go wherever you like." She did not take the paper immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something that might not be real. "Why?" she asked. The word came out rougher than she intended, scraped and raw, because that was the word that mattered. Not what had happened, but why a stranger would do something like that for someone he had never met. Levi Dunlap looked at her steadily. His eyes were a dark hazel, the color of creek water over stones, and they were honest in a way that was almost uncomfortable because she had stopped expecting honesty from anyone a long time ago. "Because it's wrong," he said simply. "Because no person should be bound by something they signed at 16. Because I had the money and I could." He paused. "And because nobody should have to count down the days of their own life like a prison sentence." He had no way of knowing that she had been counting. She had never told anyone that she counted. The back of her throat went tight and strange. She took the paper. She unfolded it. Her own name was there and Belmore's, and the date 4 days prior when the contract would have been considered active, and across the whole thing in heavy black ink was written "paid in full, released," and below that Levi's signature, and below that the date April 9th, 1878. "Walk away," he said quietly. "Wherever you like." She looked up at him. "And if I don't know where that is?" He considered this with a seriousness she hadn't expected. Most men, when they were being generous, wanted you to be grateful and go. They didn't want to be asked harder questions. But he thought about it genuinely, standing there on the porch with his hat in his hands and the April wind moving through his hair, and then he said, "Then take some time to figure it out. There's no rush. Freedom doesn't have a deadline." She almost smiled. She didn't quite manage it, but it was closer than she'd come in months. She spent the rest of that morning in a kind of stunned daze. Belmore sulked in his back office and did not speak to her. She packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, an extra pair of boots worn thin at the sole, a small tin mirror, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a handful of letters she had never sent because she had nobody to send them to, and she bundled them into a canvas bag. She walked out the front door of the Belmore Trading Post for the last time at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in April, and she stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with the wind in her hair and the sun overhead, and not the faintest idea what she was supposed to do next. Freedom, it turned out, was terrifying. She had a little money. She'd saved carefully, quietly, scraping back what she could from the meager wages Belmore allowed her to keep, but not enough for a train ticket to anywhere meaningful, and not enough to rent a room for more than a few nights. She had no family that she could go back to. Her father had left Caldwell 2 years ago, and nobody had heard from him since, which was fine with Rose because she had no desire to see him. She had no trade other than cleaning and cooking and keeping books, skills that were useful, but that also, in a town like Caldwell, tended to lead women straight back into the same kind of arrangements she had just escaped. She was sitting on a bench outside the general store, her canvas bag at her feet and the contract paper folded in her skirt pocket, when Levi Dunlap found her again. He was leading his bay horse, its saddlebags now heavy with whatever supplies he'd bought, and he stopped when he saw her. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said. He didn't press her. He tied his horse to the rail and sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectable distance between them, and he waited. It was such an unusual thing to have someone simply wait without demanding or explaining or filling the silence with their own needs, that she found herself looking at him sideways, trying to understand him. "Do you have family?" he asked eventually, not in a prying way, just asking. "No, not anymore," she paused. "What about you?" "A brother in Missouri. My parents passed. I've got the ranch." He looked out at the street where a wagon loaded with hides was rolling past. "I bought the land 2 years ago. It's good land. The river runs along the eastern edge. I've got about 40 head of cattle and some horses and a house I built mostly myself, which means parts of it are more solid than other parts." She almost smiled again, closer this time. "I'm not trying to offer you a situation," he said, and she heard the care in how he said it, the deliberate clarity. "I just want to make sure you've got a decent option before I ride out. You've got a right to know what's available to you." She turned to look at him fully. "What is available to me?" "There's a woman in town named Mrs. Clara Holt. She runs the millinery shop on the north end of the main street. She's a widow, reputable. She's been looking for a paid helper. Real wages, fair conditions. I could introduce you if you want." He paused. "Or if you need somewhere to stay for a few days while you figure things out, the boarding house on 2nd Street is decent, and the woman who runs it is honest." He had, she realized, already thought about this. He had come into town this morning knowing about the contract, and he had bought it out, and he had thought ahead to what she would need afterward. Nobody had thought ahead for Rose Prescott in a very long time. The sensation was disorienting, like stepping onto ice and finding it solid. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "show me where the shop is." He stood up, and she stood up, and they walked together down the main street of Caldwell in the spring sunshine. And it was the first ordinary walk Rose had taken since she was 16 years old, and it felt like the most extraordinary thing in the world. Clara Holt was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with silver hair, pinned up neatly, and ink-stained fingers from the ledger books she kept with meticulous precision. She looked Rose over with the frank assessment of a woman who had built her own livelihood and knew exactly what she needed to maintain it, and then she said, "Can you sew?" "Yes," Rose said. "Can you keep books?" "Yes." "Can you deal with difficult customers without losing your composure?" Rose thought about 3 years of Belmore. "Yes," she said. Clara nodded once decisively. $4 a month, meals included, Sundays free. I've got a small room above the shop. It's yours if you want it." It was more than she'd had. It was more than she'd been promised in years. Rose looked at Clara Holt and felt something unclench in her chest, some long-held tension she had carried so long she'd forgotten it had a name. "Yes," she said again, "I'll take it." When she turned around, Levi was standing in the doorway of the shop with his hat in his hand again, and he was smiling a small, quiet smile, the kind that didn't demand anything, that was just genuinely glad for someone else's good fortune. She would remember that smile for a long time afterward. She would remember exactly the way the afternoon light came through the front window and caught the angles of his face. "All right," he said. "Good luck to you, Miss Prescott." "Rose," she said. "Just Rose." "Good luck to you, Rose." He put his hat back on and walked out into the April afternoon, and she watched him through the window as he untied his bay horse and swung up into the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years on horseback. He rode northeast, toward the Chicaskia River and the 40 cattle and the house he'd built mostly himself, and Rose watched him until the dust of his passage settled back into the street. She started work at the millinery shop the next morning. The days that followed were not easy, but they were honest, which was something Rose had not had in a long time. Clara Holt was demanding and exacting and occasionally sharp-tongued, but she was scrupulously fair, and she paid what she promised, and she did not treat Rose as less than a person. Rose learned to trim hats with ribbon and silk flowers and small net veils. She learned to fit them to women's heads with pins and patience. She kept the books, and the books were a pleasure to her, the clean precision of numbers, the satisfaction of columns that balanced. She slept in the small room above the shop with its single window that looked out over the rooftops toward the prairie, and she did not have to count down any days at all. But she thought about Levi Dunlap. She thought about him with a regularity that she found inconvenient and a depth that she found alarming. She thought about the way he had held his hat against his chest. She thought about his careful explanation of the contract, the deliberate clarity of it, as though he knew she would need to hear it laid out plainly without embellishment or manipulation. She thought about the fact that he had already planned what help she might need before she'd even known she was going to need it. And she thought about that small smile in Clara's doorway, and she thought about his hands, which were big and were cruffined, and had held that piece of paper out to her with a steadiness that she had found, against all her better judgment, moving. She was not naive. She knew that a man doing a kind thing was not the same as a man being trustworthy in all ways, and she had lived long enough under Belmore's roof to understand that apparent generosity could come with hidden debts. But there had been something in Levi Dunlap's face, something in the uncomplicated way he had simply stated his reasons and then stepped back from any expectation of return, that made her unable to put him cleanly in the category of danger. He came back to town 6 weeks later. She saw him from the window of the millinery shop, riding down the main street on his bay horse, and her pulse did something wholly unreasonable, which she chose to attribute to surprise. He stopped at the trading company first, the new trading company, Caldwell having recently opened a proper general store alongside the older establishments, and then he came past Clara's shop, and he looked up at the window, and he saw her standing there, and he lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in greeting. She lifted her hand in return. He hesitated on his horse for a moment, then dismounted and came into the shop. The bell above the door rang, and Clara, who was working at the back table, looked up and assessed him with the same frank efficiency she applied to everything. "Mr. Dunlap," she said, "can I help you?" "Actually," he said, with a slight uncertainty that Rose found she liked, "I was hoping to speak to Rose, if that's convenient." Clara looked at Rose, and then back at Levi, and Rose would have sworn there was a slight upward movement at the corner of the older woman's mouth. "I imagine it is," Clara said, and returned to her work with a studied lack of interest that was not in the least convincing. Rose came around the counter, and they stood near the front window in the pale morning light, and Levi turned his hat in his hands again. She noticed that, the way he did that, and she thought it meant he was nervous, which seemed improbable and also entirely endearing. "I was wondering," he said, "if you'd care to take a walk, if you're not too busy." "I have an hour before the Watson sisters come in for their fitting," she said. They walked down to the end of the main street and then along the edge of town where the prairie opened up, all tall grass and wind and the impossibly wide sky that Rose had always loved about Kansas. The way the sky here was not a backdrop but a presence, something enormous and alive overhead. The cattle sounds from the holding pens drifted on the wind, and somewhere a mockingbird was running through its entire repertoire, seemingly for the sheer pleasure of it. "How are you getting on?" he asked. "With Mrs. Holt?" "Well," she said, "better than well. She's taught me more about running a business than I expected to learn this quickly." "She's a sharp woman," he said. "Her husband passed 4 years ago and she built the shop back up from near nothing. She doesn't give anyone credit she doesn't think they've earned. She seems to think I've earned some. She told me, before I left that day, that you had good eyes," he said. "She said you looked at the shop like you were already thinking about how to improve it." Rose stopped walking. "She said that to you? Before you even came in for the interview?" He smiled. She'd already made up her mind. Rose stared at the horizon for a moment, thinking about that, and then she said something she hadn't planned to say. "I've been thinking about why you did it," she said. "Buying out the contract, I keep turning it over." He was quiet. "And I can't figure it out completely," she said, "except that I think you're the kind of man who can't look away from an injustice if he's in a position to do something about it. Is that right?" He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass with that particular sound it made, like breathing. "My mother," he said finally, "when she was young, before she met my father, she was in a similar situation. Not identical, but similar. A man had control of her life through an arrangement she hadn't chosen. She got out eventually, with help from someone who didn't ask for anything back. She used to talk about that. The weight of owing something to someone who wants nothing from you." He paused. "I thought about her when the deputy told me about you." Rose was looking at him. He was looking at the horizon. There was a rawness in his voice that he was managing carefully, keeping tamped down, and she felt it reach through all her careful distance and touch something in her that she had been protecting for a very long time. "I'm glad you heard," she said. "So am I," he said, and he turned and looked at her, and the afternoon light made everything sharp and golden, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the silence was not empty but full of something that was only just beginning to take a shape they could recognize. They walked back to the shop, and she went in to fit the Watson sisters for their new bonnets, and Levi Dunlap rode northeast toward the Chicaskia River, and she stood at the window again and watched him go, but this time it was different. This time she knew he would come back. He came back the following month and the month after that. Each time he stayed a day, sometimes two. He always found an hour to walk with her or sit on the bench outside the general store and talk. They talked about everything, which was something Rose had almost forgotten was possible, real conversation, the kind that moved from practical matters to ideas to questions to laughter and back again, without any of the careful maneuvering she had learned to use to protect herself in Belmore's house. Levi listened when she talked. He didn't listen impatiently, waiting for his turn to speak. He listened as though what she said genuinely interested him, which it seemed to, and which was intoxicating in a way she hadn't anticipated. She learned things about him. He had come to Kansas from Texas 2 years ago, following the cattle trails north and deciding he liked the land enough to stay. He had punched cattle for 6 years, working trail drives from South Texas up through the nations and into Kansas, and he had saved carefully and bought his land at a cattle sale when a rancher outside Caldwell was selling off parcels. He had spent his first winter on the property living in a canvas tent while he built the house, which he described with a self-deprecating detail that made her laugh. The wall that leaned slightly to the east, the chimney that worked fine in good weather and smoked badly in wind, the root cellar that had been intended to be considerably deeper than it ended up being because he'd hit rock. He had a dog named Wheeler, a big brown mixed breed who had attached himself to the ranch property one day and declined to leave, and he spoke of the dog with an affection that Rose found entirely winning. She told him things, too, which surprised her more. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Rose was 12 and who had been gentle and funny, and had taught Rose to read from a single well-worn book of poetry. She told him about the years before the contract, how she and her father had moved from town to town, following his work and his losing streaks, and how she had learned early to make a home out of whatever they had, to find the good in a boarding room or a farmhouse loft. She told him carefully about Belmore, not all of it, not the worst of the daily diminishment, but enough that Levi's expression went very still and very serious in a way that made her feel seen without feeling pitied, which was a distinction she had not known mattered so much to her until it did. By August, she had been at the millinery shop for 4 months, and she was good at her work, and Caldwell had begun to feel, tentatively, like something approaching home. Clara Holt had given her a small raise and had started including her in decisions about the shop's direction, What styles to stock, which suppliers to use, how to price the new fall inventory. Rose had a routine. She had Sunday afternoons entirely her own, which she spent walking the edges of town and reading or writing letters she now had actual people to send, because Clara had introduced her to a network of women across the territory who corresponded regularly about business and books and the thousand small details of managing their own lives. She had friends, or the beginning of friends, and she was in love, though she had not said so to anyone, including herself, in so many words. She was in love with Levi Dunlap, the way you fall in love with something that was already familiar before you met it. The way you love a landscape you have never visited, but that matches a picture you've been carrying. The way he looked when he was thinking, that slight crease between his brows, that quality of stillness. The way he talked about his land, with a specificity and devotion that was almost poetic. The way a man talks about something he has built with his own hands and tended with real care. The way he was in the world, which was honestly and without pretension. The way he treated everyone around him, Clara, the store clerk, the man who saddled horses at the livery, with the same basic respect he extended to anyone, as though it had simply never occurred to him to do otherwise. The way he had stood on the porch of the trading post and held out that paper and said, "Walk away wherever you like," and meant it, wholly and without reservation. She had not told him any of this. She was not yet sure she was brave enough to. In September, a situation arose that changed the shape of things considerably. A man named Harlan Cross rode into Caldwell with a crew of 3 and a bad reputation that preceded him like weather. Cross had been a cattle buyer, then a land speculator, then something harder to categorize, and he was known in the territory as a man who collected outstanding debts with a persistence and lack of scruple that had made him a number of enemies. He came into Clara's shop one morning while Rose was alone, Clara having gone to the bank, and he wanted a hat trimmed, which was innocent enough, and then he was looking at her with a recognition she couldn't place, and then he said something that turned her blood to ice. "You're Gerald Prescott's girl." She straightened and kept her voice level. "I was." "Your father owes me money," Cross said pleasantly. He was a lean, gray-haired man with a thin mouth and eyes like creek pebbles, flat and unreflective. Quite a lot of money, as it happens. A debt that, in certain legal interpretations, could be argued to have passed to his dependents. "I am not his dependent," Rose said. "I am not dependent on anyone." He turned the hat he'd brought in over in his hands. "The law in this territory is an interesting thing. A father's debts cannot be transferred to a daughter who is legally an adult and has been legally separate from her father's affairs for some time," Rose said crisply, because she had learned to read carefully and she had read the statutes that Clara kept in a stack of legal references under the shop counter. "I suggest you speak with the county sheriff if you have a legitimate claim, Mr. Cross." Cross smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps I'll do that," he said, and set the hat down on the counter and walked out of the shop. Rose's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter and breathed until they stopped. Then she sat down on the shop stool and thought carefully about what she knew and what she needed to know and what she needed to do. When Clara returned, she told her everything immediately, and Clara's expression went through several rapid changes before settling on a kind of grim practicality. "Cross is a schemer," she said. "He looks for cracks to lever open. Your father's debts can't touch you legally, but he might try to make enough noise to be inconvenient." She paused. "Does Levi know Cross?" Rose looked at her. Clara looked back with that slight upward movement at the corner of her mouth that she deployed whenever she thought the obvious needed to be said. "He comes to town next week," Rose said. "Well then," said Clara, and went back to work. Levi arrived on the second Tuesday of September, and Rose told him about Cross over their usual walk. She told it plainly, without drama, but he listened with an increasing stillness that she recognized by now as a sign of things going on under the surface. "I know of Cross," he said when she finished. He tried to buy out a neighboring spread last year by claiming there was a lien on the land that turned out to be fabricated. He backed off when the owner got a lawyer involved. He paused. He's a bully who dresses it up in legal language, and he'll usually move on when he meets actual resistance. Clara said the same. Clara's right. He stopped walking and turned to look at her. I can speak to the sheriff on your behalf, lay out what your father's actual legal standing is in relation to you if that would help. Make it official and documented so Cross has no leverage at all. I can do that myself, she said. I know you can, he said easily, not defending or retreating. I'm offering, not insisting. You'll handle it however you think is best. She looked at him. The September sky was enormous above them, clouds building in the west, the grass golden and dry at the end of summer. We could go together, she said. They went together. Sheriff Tom Aldridge, a weathered man of practical disposition, listened to Rose's account with attention and then agreed that her father's debts had no legal purchase on her person or property, signed a document to that effect, and sent it to Cross's known address in Wichita by the next mail. Cross did not return to Caldwell, or if he did not visit the millinery shop, and the matter settled like dust after a wagon passes. But something else had happened in the sheriff's office and in the walk back, something small and significant. Levi had sat beside her at the sheriff's desk and not spoken for her, not interrupted, not taken over. He had been simply present, a solid, quiet presence at her side, and when she was done and they stood to leave, he had placed one hand briefly on her shoulder, just a brief steadying touch, and she had covered that hand with her own for just a moment, almost without thinking, and they had both been very still, and then they had walked out together into the September afternoon. They stood outside the sheriff's office in the slanting light, and Levi said, "I have to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "I've been coming to town," he said carefully, "every 4 to 6 weeks for 5 months now, and each time I've stayed longer than I had any particular business reason to stay." He paused. He turned his hat in his hands. "I think you know why." Her heart was doing something complicated. "I think I do," she said. "I don't want to assume anything," he said, and his voice was careful but not stiff earnest, she thought. The word was earnest, which was a word she had stopped applying to men a long time ago. "I know you've been through things that gave you good reasons to be cautious, and I know that what you needed when I first came to town was to be free, not to find yourself in some other arrangement." He was looking at her very directly. "But I'd like to court you properly if you're willing, if that's something you want." The word court sat in the air between them with all its old-fashioned weight, and Rose felt the corners of her mouth move in something that was no longer almost a smile but the real thing. "It is something I want," she said. He let out a breath, quiet, controlled, but she heard the relief in it and it touched her. That he had been uncertain, that he had been hoping, that he had not simply assumed. "Good," he said. He put his hat back on. He was smiling, the real smile now, the one she thought about when she was alone in her room above the shop. "Good." The courtship that followed was conducted with a kind of unhurried intentionality that suited them both. Levi came to Caldwell more frequently, every 2 or 3 weeks now instead of every 4 to 6, and when he came they walked and talked and occasionally had supper at the hotel dining room, which was the best eating establishment in Caldwell, and which Clara Holt declared was entirely appropriate and not excessive. He brought her small things. Once a book of poetry he had ordered from a catalog, because she had mentioned her mother's book, and once a piece of red ribbon he had seen in a shop window in Wichita on a supply run and thought she might like for her hair, and once, memorably, a jar of wild plum preserves made by the wife of his nearest neighboring rancher, a woman named Mrs. Garza, who had sent it with Levi along with a message that Rose found both touching and slightly alarming in its specificity. Apparently, Mrs. Garza had been trying to find a reason to send Levi Dunlap something to eat for over a year, and was very glad he had finally given her one. In October, he asked her to come see the ranch. Mrs. Garza came along as a chaperone, which was her own enthusiastic suggestion. She lived with her husband Eduardo 3 miles from Levi's spread, and she arrived at their agreed meeting point on the Caldwell Road in a wagon with a picnic basket, wearing her best dress and an expression of unconcealed excitement that made Rose like her instantly. Elena Garza was a small, lively woman in her mid-30s with quick dark eyes and an opinion on nearly everything, which she delivered with a frankness that reminded Rose of Clara Holt, and she and Rose fell into conversation immediately and maintained it for most of the 2-hour journey. Levi rode alongside the wagon on his bay horse. He caught Rose's eye once, looking slightly overwhelmed by the combined conversational energy of the two women, and she gave him a look of entirely unsympathetic amusement, and he grinned, and she thought, yes, yes, this is the person I want to be looking at for a very long time. The ranch was exactly as he had described it, and also nothing like she had imagined, because descriptions rarely capture the quality of light on a particular stretch of land or the way a river sounds in late autumn when the cottonwoods along its bank are all turned golden. The house sat on a slight rise overlooking a long meadow, and it was plain and solid, built of limestone blocks and timber, with a porch that ran the full length of the front, and a chimney that did, indeed, lean very slightly in a direction that suggested the builder had been improvising. But it was sound. It was clean. It had been made carefully by someone who cared about making it well. Wheeler the dog appeared from behind the barn at their approach, barking with the professional enthusiasm of an animal who considers arrivals his personal responsibility. And then he reached Rose and shoved his large head against her hand with a force that left her laughing, and Levi said, "He doesn't do that with everyone," with a satisfaction that was entirely transparent. They ate their picnic at a table in the yard that Levi had set up with a care. He seemed faintly embarrassed about a proper cloth, tin plates that had been very recently polished. And Elena Garza talked about the territory and the cattle business, and the particular joys and challenges of living 20 miles from the nearest town. And Eduardo Garza, who was quiet but warm and who had the kind of easy steadiness that comes from being very comfortable in your own life, asked Levi about the winter plans for the cattle. Rose watched Levi talk about his land, the same way she had listened to him describe it in words, and saw again that quality she had noticed before, the particular devotion of someone who has worked hard for something and found it worth the working. After the picnic, Levi showed her the property. Just the two of them, while Elena and Eduardo sat companionably at the table with the last of the coffee. He showed her the barn and the horses and the meadow where the cattle grazed and the river bank where the cottonwoods grew, and he talked about what he hoped to do with the land: more cattle, eventually, maybe horses to breed, a proper kitchen garden once he had the time, and the additional hands to manage it. He talked about it the way you talk about a future you can see clearly, a future that has specific dimensions and colors. "You love it," she said, standing at the river bank with the golden leaves catching the light. "I do," he said. She looked at the river for a moment. Then she said, "I've never had a place that was mine, not really. We moved so much when I was young, and then there was Belmore's, and the room above Clara's shop is the closest I've come, but it's still hers." She paused. "I didn't realize how much I wanted one until just now." He was quiet beside her. Then he said quietly, "This could be yours too, if you wanted it, eventually, if that's something you'd consider." He said it carefully, without pressure, not a declaration but an opening, leaving the door wide for her to walk through or not. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that honest hazel gaze, that steadiness that she had come to think of as one of his essential qualities, like the color of his eyes or the way he held his hat. "Ask me properly," she said. He took a breath. "Rose Prescott," he said, and his voice was low and serious, and also, she thought, slightly awed, as though he could not quite believe he was asking, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without the pause she might have expected from herself. "Yes, I will." He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, those big calloused hands that had held out a piece of paper to her on a porch in April, and said, "Walk away wherever you like." And he kissed her for the first time, gently and carefully, the way you approach something precious. And the October sun came through the cottonwood leaves in pieces of gold, and she thought that she had crossed a border, some invisible line between the life that had been happening to her and the life she was choosing, and that she was on the right side of it now, at last. From the direction of the picnic table, faintly audible over the sound of the river, came Elena Garza's voice saying something in rapid Spanish and Eduardo's answering laugh. Rose pulled back and looked at Levi and laughed too, and he pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood there at the river bank with the leaves falling around them, laughing. They rode back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, Rose sitting in the wagon with Elena, who held Rose's hand, and talked about weddings with an expert enthusiasm that suggested she had been planning this in her head for some time. Levi rode beside them, quieter than usual, but when Rose caught his eye he smiled, that particular smile of his, the one she'd first seen in Clara's doorway, only now it was bigger, the full width of it, unreserved, and she thought it might be the best thing she'd ever seen in her life. Clara Holt received the news with the expression of a woman whose long-held opinion of her own judgment has been confirmed. "Good," she said. "You'll be glad." And then she hugged Rose with a warmth that surprised Rose entirely, and that made Clara look briefly embarrassed, which was also a gift. The wedding was set for March, which gave them the winter to prepare. It was agreed that Rose would continue at the millinery shop until the wedding, and Clara would begin training her eventual replacement, though Clara made it clear that Rose was always welcome back, that the books could still be kept by mail, that the friendship between them was not contingent on the employment. That winter was one of the better things that had ever happened to Rose. Levi came to town almost every week, sometimes just for an evening, and they had long conversations by the stove in Clara's front parlor about what the ranch could be, and Rose found herself with opinions about it, about the kitchen garden she'd like to plant in the spring, about the extra room that might be added to the house's east side, about the colors she'd paint the interior if she were choosing, which, Levi told her with a warmth in his eyes, she absolutely was. She wrote letters to Mrs. Garza about seeds and what grew well in the Kansas soil. She and Clara corresponded with a millinery supplier in St. Louis about a possible catalog arrangement that would let Clara keep growing the shop without Rose. And in the evenings, sometimes, when the town was quiet and the stove was warm and Wheeler was sleeping at their feet because Levi had started bringing the dog with him on his visits, he would read to her. He had turned out to be a reader, which was something she had not known about him at first, and he had a good reader's voice, quiet and measured, with a clear feeling for rhythm. He would read to her from novels and from newspapers and once, memorably, from the book of poetry he'd given her in the fall, and she would sit across from him in the lamplight and sometimes not listen to the words at all, just to the sound, just to the fact of being here, safe and warm and entirely herself. She told him things she had not expected to tell him. About the specific quality of the fear that had lived in her at Belmore's, not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the grinding fear of permanent diminishment, the fear that she would be forgotten there, that she would simply wear down and disappear without anyone noticing. About the way she had constructed herself during those years, layer by layer, a version of Rose Prescott that was competent and contained and did not need anything, because needing things only made the lack of them worse. About how strange and frightening and also how necessary it was to take those layers off again. He listened to all of it. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it or offer silver linings. He just listened, and sometimes he said things like, "That sounds like it was very lonely." Not pitying, just naming, just witnessing. And she found, to her own surprise, that being witnessed was what she had needed more than almost anything. He told her things, too. About the years on the cattle trail, which had been hard in ways he described honestly, the tedium, the weather, the particular exhaustion of responsibility for other men and animals across hundreds of miles of uncertain ground. About the years when he had not been sure what he was working toward, when the accumulation of savings felt abstract and the future felt distant, and he was not certain sometimes whether the life he was living was the one he actually wanted. About finding the land. About the quality of rightness he had felt standing on the Chicaskia River bank for the first time, a feeling he had not expected and had not known he was looking for until he felt it. About his mother and the woman who had helped her, and the way that story had lived in him all these years as something he had hoped to honor if he ever got the chance. One evening in January, sitting by Clara's stove with the winter wind pushing at the windows, he said something that Rose kept with her for a long time afterward. He said, "I think sometimes about the version of you that had been in Belmore's for the full 5 years, and I'm glad that version doesn't exist. Not because I wouldn't have," he stopped himself, started again, "because you should have always been exactly who you are right now, not worn down, not less." He paused. "I'm glad you're whole." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm glad too. I'm glad I'm here." She reached across the small table between them and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers, and the stove ticked warmly, and outside the winter wind went on speaking its cold and indifferent language to the Kansas prairie, and inside it was warm and still and real. The spring of 1879 came with an extravagance after the hard winter, the grass coming up green and thick along the river bottoms, the sky going from iron gray to a blue so intense it seemed almost to vibrate. Rose and Levi were married on the 15th of March in the small church on the edge of Caldwell, which had a real minister now, the Reverend James Hatch, who had arrived from Ohio 6 months prior, and who conducted the service with a quiet gravity that suited the occasion. Clara Holt stood up for Rose, which is to say she was her only attendant, and she wore a new hat of her own creation that was frankly magnificent. Elena Garza was there with Eduardo, who had ridden 30 miles in the early morning to arrive in time, and who clasped Levi's hand with the warmth of a man congratulating someone he is genuinely fond of. Sheriff Aldredge attended and shook both their hands afterward with the gravity of a man who takes a particular pleasure in outcomes that work out properly. Most of the regular population of Caldwell came through the church at some point during the morning, because Caldwell was a border town on the edge of everything, but it was also a community, and communities attend their own celebrations. Rose wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, a deep blue that Clara had helped her choose from a fabric shipment in February, and she had her mother's Bible and a crown of dried prairie flowers that Elena had made for her the evening before. And when she walked up the aisle of the small church on Clara's arm and saw Levi standing at the front with his best coat and his clean-cut jaw in his hands, predictably and endearingly, turning his hat in front of him, she felt something settle in her chest that she thought might be there for good. They said their vows with clear voices and without ceremony. Levi put a plain gold ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita 3 months ago, and she put a plain band on his, and they kissed briefly in front of the assembled population of Caldwell while Wheeler, tied to the church post outside, commented audibly on the proceedings. Afterward there was food at the hotel, contributed by half the town in the tradition of such occasions, and music from a fiddler named Archie Grimes who appeared at most significant social events in Caldwell, and who played reels with a furious, joyful energy that got even the most reluctant people on their feet. Levi danced with Rose and then with Clara, and then with Elena while Eduardo and Rose talked about the ranch. Clara danced with Sheriff Aldredge, which surprised everyone including, visibly, Clara herself. The afternoon went on in that good long way that the best occasions do, unhurried, full of talk and laughter, and the particular warmth of people genuinely pleased to be together. They drove out to the ranch as the sun was going down, in Levi's wagon loaded with the things Rose was bringing with her: the books, the clothes, her mother's Bible, the small tin mirror, the box of letters and correspondence. Several objects Clara had given her as wedding gifts, including a set of proper kitchen implements that were considerably better than anything Levi currently owned. Wheeler ran alongside the wagon for the first mile, and then gave up and trotted behind at his own pace, entirely undignified and entirely content. The ranch house, when they arrived, had a lamp burning in the window. Elena had ridden out ahead and lit it, and left food on the table covered by a cloth, and a note that said simply, "Welcome home, Rose." Rose stood in the doorway of the house and looked at the lamp and the table and the solid limestone walls and the chimney that leaned slightly east, and she felt the word in her chest before she thought it. Home. She thought about the girl who had stood on the main street of Caldwell with a canvas bag at her feet and not the faintest idea where to go, and she thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and she thought, this is what freedom actually looks like. Not the absence of things, but the presence of the right ones. "Come in," Levi said behind her quietly, and she stepped across the threshold and he followed her, and the door closed against the March night, and the lamp made the limestone walls golden. The first year of marriage was the kind of year that builds something permanent. Rose planted the kitchen garden in April, with seeds Mrs. Garza had helped her order from a catalog, and a layout she had sketched through the winter evenings. By summer it was producing more than the two of them could eat, and she was trading with the Garzas and sending preserves to Clara with the mail wagon. Levi added a room to the east side of the house, as they had discussed, and it went up straighter than the original construction, which he was quietly pleased about, and which Rose painted a soft yellow that made the whole house feel broader and lighter. She went into Caldwell every few weeks, sometimes with Levi and sometimes on her own driving the smaller wagon, and she sat with Clara over the shop accounts and drank coffee in the kitchen above the shop, and maintained the friendship that had become one of the fixed points of her life. She also, quietly and carefully, began to do something she had not done since she was 16. She began to make plans for herself. Not survival plans, not endurance plans, but actual plans for a future she was choosing. She wrote letters to the county land office about the possibility of establishing a small correspondence business for women in outlying homesteads, facilitating orders from suppliers in the cities, and taking a modest commission. She discussed the idea with Clara, who refined it with her characteristic efficiency, and then connected Rose with two women in Wichita who had done something similar. By autumn it was a real, if modest, enterprise, and Rose kept the books with the same pleasure she always had, and found that she was, in the practical daily sense, happy. She was happy in ways she hadn't known how to anticipate. Happy in the evenings when Levi came in from the cattle work and smelled of hay and open air, and sat down at the table and ate whatever she had made with an appreciation that was genuine and specific. "This is better than anything I made myself in 4 years of cooking," which admittedly isn't saying much. Happy in the mornings when the light came over the eastern hills and through the kitchen window, and she had her coffee, and he had his, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Happy when they argued, which they did occasionally, and with the productive frankness of two people who trusted each other enough to disagree about money, about the cattle operation's pace of expansion, about the relative merits of a second dog, which Rose favored and Levi resisted until the day he came home with a small brown puppy under his coat, and an expression of someone who has conclusively lost an argument with himself. They named the puppy Sage, because she was the color of the prairie plant and had the same tough determinedness, and Wheeler ignored her with magnificent disdain for 3 days before accepting her completely. In November of 1879, Rose told Levi she was expecting a child. He went very still, the way he went still when things mattered, and then he reached across the kitchen table and took both her hands and said, "Rose," just that, her name, as though it contained everything else he meant to say, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way through her. The pregnancy was uneventful by the standards of the time and the territory, which is to say it was uncomfortable and occasionally frightening, and required considerable practical management. But Rose was strong and pragmatic, and Clara came out to the ranch in February to stay for the last weeks before the birth, bringing her own forthright competence and a stockpile of medical knowledge accumulated over decades of frontier living. Elena Garza came too, as the time approached, and the two women ran the household with a cheerful efficiency that left Levi feeling simultaneously grateful and unnecessary, a condition he managed by working very hard outdoors and checking in at frequent intervals, until Elena told him gently but definitively to stop hovering. Their son was born on a morning in late March 1880, exactly a year and 12 days after their wedding, in the bedroom of the limestone house, while the spring rain tapped at the window and Wheeler, and Sage patrolled anxiously in the yard outside. He was healthy and loud, and had Levi's dark hair and Rose's stubbornness, which became apparent within the first hour of his life. They named him Thomas James Dunlap Thomas for Levi's father, James for no reason except that it sounded right to both of them. Levi held the baby for the first time sitting in the chair by the bedroom window with the rain light on his face, and he looked at the small, furious creature in his arms with an expression Rose had never seen on him before, something unguarded and enormous, and she watched him from the bed and thought, "This is everything. This specific moment, this room, this man, this child, this life we made out of nothing but choice and work and the plain determination to be decent to each other. This is what she had walked toward, that morning on the porch of the trading post when a stranger held out a piece of paper and gave her back her own life. In the months that followed, the ranch grew around them. Levi bought additional cattle, bringing the herd to over 80 head, and hired a hand named Pete Colby, a quiet young man from Missouri who was good with horses and not much for talking, which suited the work well. Rose's correspondence business had grown enough to require a second day of accounting each week, and Clara had twice sent customers her way who needed purchasing facilitation from suppliers in Denver and Kansas City. The kitchen garden produced a surplus that Rose was now formally selling through the Caldwell General Store, and the small extra income went into a savings account at the county bank, the first savings account Rose had ever held in her own name, which she kept the passbook for in her mother's Bible. The territory was changing around them in those years. The cattle trade was evolving, the wide open ranges being slowly fenced and parceled, the great trail drives beginning their long decline as the railheads moved and the land fills settled. Caldwell grew and then contracted and then grew again in a different shape. The Indian Territory to the south was under its own profound pressure, the tribes there navigating losses and indignities that Rose was aware of, and that she and Levi talked about with a seriousness and a sorrow that they could not translate into action large enough to matter, which was its own particular weight. The world was moving towards something, though no one could see yet what it was. In the spring of 1882, when Thomas was 2 years old and saying everything with a volume and specificity that regularly astonished his parents, Clara Holt wrote to Rose with news of her own. She was selling the millinery shop. Not because the business had failed, on the contrary, the catalog arrangement Rose had helped set up had made it profitable enough that a buyer from Wichita had made a serious offer, but because Clara's sister in St. Louis had been widowed and needed help, and Clara, at 61, wanted to be needed somewhere that required less prairie wind and more family. She was going north in July. Rose read the letter sitting at the kitchen table while Thomas toddled around her feet, and she felt the particular grief of losing something you have been holding as a fixed point. She and Clara had already discussed this possibility, obliquely, over the past year. Clara had mentioned her sister, had spoken of St. Louis with a wistfulness, but knowing it was coming did not make the arrival easier. She wrote back immediately, a long letter full of real feeling, and Clara's response was characteristically clear. "Don't be sad for me. I'm going to something good. The sadness is yours to keep, which means it was real, which means we did this right." And then at the end, "You have made my last years in Kansas considerably brighter than they would otherwise have been. I hope you know that. I hope you know what you're worth, Rose Dunlap." Clara came to the ranch the week before she left Caldwell for the last time. She stayed 3 days. She was herself entirely, sharp-eyed and warm-hearted and frankly opinionated and quietly loving in the way that had always been her particular gift. And on her last morning she held Thomas with a tenderness that made him stare at her in wide-eyed evaluation before apparently deciding. She met his standards and patting her face with both hands. She and Rose sat on the front porch in the early light with their coffee and were quiet together, the way they had learned they could be, and Clara said, "You are going to be all right, you know. You have been all right for some time." "I know," Rose said. "I just like knowing you're nearby. Write to me, every week. And tell Levi to keep that chimney from leaning any further east or he'll lose it by winter." "I will." Clara's wagon raised a long thread of dust on the road to Caldwell, and Rose watched it until it was out of sight. And then she went back into the house, where Levi was feeding Thomas breakfast, with the specific patient negotiating manner that the child's opinions about food required. And she sat down at the table and said nothing about it, just being there in the room. And Levi looked at her over Thomas's head with a quietly understanding expression and reached across and squeezed her hand once, briefly. And that was enough. She wrote to Clara every week, and Clara wrote back, and the letters were long and substantive and full of the real texture of their respective lives, and the friendship endured entirely well across the miles, which they had both expected and were glad of. That summer Levi hired a second ranch hand, a man named George Webb, who was a few years older than Levi and had worked cattle from the Rio Grande to the Dakotas, and who could fix almost anything mechanical with a patience and ingenuity that made him invaluable. With Pete and George, the ranch could manage itself through the more intensive periods, which meant that Levi and Rose could occasionally both be absent at the same time, a flexibility that felt like luxury after the years of being bound always to the land. They used it once to take Thomas on the train from Wichita to Kansas City. It was Thomas's first train ride, and he was magnificently unimpressed by the mechanics of it but deeply fascinated by the other passengers, particularly an elderly man in a tall hat who played a small harmonica, and a family of 5 children who were apparently engaged in some kind of ongoing territorial dispute that Thomas found deeply instructive. Rose sat by the window and watched the Kansas landscape unroll outside the glass, the grasslands giving way to farms, and then to the gathering density of a real city. And she thought about the 16-year-old girl who had never been anywhere and the woman she was now, with her son on her lap and her husband's arm against hers, and a life that she had built, with help and with her own 2 hands, into something that was genuinely hers. In Kansas City, they stayed 2 nights at a proper hotel, which Thomas found so extraordinary in its carpets and staircases that he required careful management at all times. They visited a dry goods supplier for the correspondence business, and a bookseller where Rose spent a carefully considered but significant amount, and Levi watched her with an indulgent happiness that he made no attempt to conceal. They ate in a restaurant where the menu ran to 4 pages, and Thomas loudly demanded the same item 3 times in a row and received it, because it seemed unnecessary to argue. On the train back, Thomas fell asleep against Rose's shoulder with the boneless completeness of a very tired small person, and Levi sat beside her in the late afternoon light, and she felt him looking at her, and she turned, and he said quietly, "Are you happy?" It was a question he asked periodically, not from insecurity but from a genuine desire to know, to check in, to make sure. She had come to understand it as one of his ways of saying, "You matter, your life here matters, none of this is assumed." "Genuinely and thoroughly happy," she said. He looked at her for another moment with that expression that had so undone her the first time, the unguarded one, the enormous one. Then he said, "Good," and settled back, and she put her head on his shoulder, and Thomas slept between them, and the train carried them home through the Kansas evening. The years that followed layered themselves into a life with the particular richness that comes from time and intention. Rose's second pregnancy, in the summer of 1883, moved faster and with more confidence than the first, and in February of 1884 she gave birth to a daughter, who arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas had managed and immediately settled into the business of regarding the world with calm, bright-eyed assessment. They named her Louisa Clara, the second name being self-explanatory to anyone who knew the circumstances, and the letter Rose wrote to Clara Holt in St. Louis announcing the name produced a response that was 3 pages long and unusually emotional for Clara, who generally kept her affections clearly stated but not excessive. Thomas, at 4, received his sister with suspicious interest that converted within a week into proprietorial devotion, and Wheeler, who was getting old and slow but still determinedly present, accepted the new human with the magnanimity of a dog who has been managing things for some time and is confident in his systems. The ranch by then ran 120 head of cattle, 2 breeding mares, and 4 working horses. The house had been extended twice, the east room first, and then a proper kitchen addition that meant Rose's cooking was no longer conducted in the original structure's inadequate original space. Pete Colby had left to start his own small operation to the north, which Levi had helped him set up with practical advice and a modest loan that Pete paid back within the year. George Webb stayed on and became, in the way of things, simply part of the place, a permanent and respected presence who ate supper at the family table on Sundays and had opinions about the cattle that Levi had long ago learned to listen to. The correspondence business had grown beyond anything Rose had initially planned. She now worked with suppliers in Denver, Kansas City, and St. Louis, facilitating orders for homestead families across a wide swath of the territory, and she had hired a woman in Caldwell to handle the local logistics. It was a real enterprise, not large but real, and it was hers in every meaningful sense. She had built it from the idea she'd had in that first winter, letter by letter, connection by connection, and it had given many isolated homestead women a practical link to the wider world that they might not otherwise have had, which Rose considered worthwhile beyond its financial returns. She thought sometimes about Belmore. Not often, and not with the old sick fear, but with a clarity that she had earned through years of distance. The trading post had changed hands twice since she'd left. Belmore himself had gone south somewhere, to Texas or beyond. She had heard various things and cared about none of them. The specific injustice of her contract, the selling of a 16-year-old's labor, the leveraging of a father's debt into a daughter's captivity, was not unique to her experience. She knew that. She had met other women whose stories had similar shapes, stories of arrangements made for or about them by men who held the pen when the papers were signed. She could not undo what had been done to her or to them, but she could witness it, and she could build something different in her own corner of the world, and she could raise her children to understand that a person's life was their own and not a currency to be traded. She told Thomas about it once, when he was 7, and asking about the trading post they passed on the way into Caldwell. She told it plainly, the way she told most things, without bitterness but without softening the real of it, because she thought he was old enough to begin to understand that the world was not always arranged fairly, and that the response to that was action and attention and care, not ignorance. Levi sat at the kitchen table while she talked and listened in that way he had, the way of a man who trusts someone else's account entirely. Afterward, Thomas was quiet for a while, thinking it through with the serious intention he brought to things that mattered, and then he said, "Pa bought the paper and said you could go, and Rose said yes, And Thomas looked at Levi with an expression so close to reverent that Levi was clearly embarrassed by it and said, "That was the right thing." And Levi said, "It was just the obvious thing if you looked at it plain," and Thomas nodded once, the matter settled in his accounting. In the autumn of 1885, a letter arrived from Levi's brother in Missouri, his brother Will, whom Rose had met twice, a steadier, quieter version of Levi with a wife named Anna and 3 children, whom Rose liked immediately. Will wrote that he and Anna were considering moving west, that Missouri was getting crowded in ways that felt wrong to him, that the land in Kansas or the territory was still open enough to build on. He asked Levi's counsel. Levi and Rose talked about it for 2 evenings in the way they had learned to talk about important things thoroughly, from all the angles, without rushing to a conclusion. The land 20 miles south of theirs was available. Levi knew the rancher who owned it and knew he was looking to sell. If Will came, they would have family nearby for the first time, which Rose felt the want of in a way she hadn't known to name until the possibility appeared. They wrote back encouraging Will strongly, and Will and Anna sold their Missouri property in the spring and arrived in Kansas in June of 1886 with 3 children and a wagon full of Missouri furniture, and a joint determination to make something work. Will bought the land 20 miles south. Levi helped him settle it with the same uncomplicated practical generosity he brought to everything. Anna was quiet and capable, and had a sense of humor so dry it operated by stealth, and she and Rose understood each other almost immediately, which was a gift Rose had not anticipated and was deeply glad of. The children, Will and Anna's 3, and Thomas and Louisa, formed an immediate and chaotic coalition that required management, but that also, Rose thought, was one of the best things she had seen in years. Children running across the Kansas grass in the particular freedom of having found their people. Christmases after that were held at the ranch on the Chicaskia River, the house full and loud and warm, with Alina and Eduardo Garza coming from their own spread, and sometimes George Webb, and whoever else the occasion had collected, and the table extended with boards into the new kitchen addition to fit everyone. Levi at the head of it, Rose at the other end, the children between them in various configurations of argument and alliance, the lamplight making everything amber. Rose would look down the length of the table at him, at his face in the familiar warm light, and he would look up and catch her looking, and the corner of his mouth would move in that small private way that was not for anyone else in the room, just for her, and she would feel it in her chest the way she always had, that particular warmth that had not faded with familiarity but had deepened and widened into something so present it was like the river at the edge of the land. Always there, always moving. Always real. In 1888, a decade after Rose had stood on the porch of the Belmore trading post with a broom in her hand and her life unmade, Clara Holt died in St. Louis at the age of 71, peacefully and in her sister's house, with people who loved her around her. The letter came from Clara's nephew, written in a careful formal hand, and Rose sat with it for a long time in the kitchen before she went to find Levi in the barn. He held her while she cried, which she did cleanly and fully and without apology, because Clara had mattered and had earned the tears. He did not say things were fine or offer perspective. He just held her, which is what she needed, and after a while she said, "She told me when she hired me that she had good instincts about people." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She was right. She was right about a lot of things, Levi said. She was right about you too, Rose said. She told me after you first came into the shop that you had an honest face. She paused. I was trying not to hope it was true. He pulled back enough to look at her. Were you? I was very suspicious of you, she said with the small honesty of it. You should have been, he said. You'd earned the right to be suspicious. And then you kept coming back and being exactly who you appeared to be, she said, which was inconvenient, frankly, because it made it very hard to maintain a reasonable caution. He laughed. She could feel it in his chest. She put her head against him and closed her eyes, and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the clean, particular smell of Kansas autumn. And Louis's voice came from outside calling for Thomas in the high-pitched way that meant she had something to say that would not wait. And the ordinary life went on around the grief the way it always does, the way it must. She sent flowers to Clara's grave by letter, which is to say she wrote to Clara's nephew, and asked him to put prairie flowers on the grave in the spring, prairie flowers being the ones Clara had always said she preferred to anything cultivated. He wrote back and said he would, and that his aunt had spoken of Rose often, and that she had kept Rose's letters tied with ribbon in her desk drawer. Rose kept that letter in her mother's Bible alongside the released contract with its paid in full in heavy black ink, and the old book of poetry, and the other things she kept that were the material record of the life she had made from the wreck of the one she'd been given. Thomas turned 12 in 1892, and was, by that point, so thoroughly his own person that Rose sometimes looked at him in a kind of delighted bewilderment. This serious and humorous and fundamentally decent person who had come from her and from Levi, and who moved through the world with a confidence that was so unlike the careful, contained girl she had been at his age, that she could see in it all the distance between the childhood she had had and the one she had given him. He was good with horses, as it turned out, with a patience and intuition that Levi recognized and cultivated, and by 12, he was doing real work on the ranch with a capability that made George Webb nod approvingly, which was as high a form of professional praise as George offered. Louisa at 8 was quieter and deeper, a child who sat with things in the way Rose did, turning them over before she spoke, and who had an eye for detail that she had apparently inherited from both parents and that expressed itself in a habit of drawing. The horses, the river, the faces of people she loved, rendered in pencil in notebooks that were already filling up. She would ask questions that arrived from unexpected angles. What did it feel like when you left Belmore's? And why do some people think they own other people? And is it possible to know when you're happy while you're being it, or do you only know afterward? And Rose would answer all of them as honestly as she could, because Louis's questions deserved honest answers, and because Rose had long ago made a commitment to raising her children in the truth of things. The spring of 1893 brought good rain and a good calf crop, and a letter from Will and Anna announcing that they were expecting a fourth child, which brought considerable celebration. It also brought a visit from a newspaper correspondent from Wichita, who was doing a piece on frontier women in business, and who had heard about Rose's correspondence enterprise through 2 separate sources and wanted to interview her. Rose sat with him on the porch in the warm spring afternoon and answered his questions plainly, including the part about starting the business from nothing, including the part about the years before, including the part about what had made her want to create specifically a service for isolated women who needed connections to the wider world. The article ran in the Wichita paper in May and was reprinted in 2 other Kansas papers. Rose read it without quite recognizing herself in it, the version of Rose Prescott that appeared in the newspaper being more dramatic and resolved than she felt from the inside, as she supposed printed versions of people always were. But Levi read it at the kitchen table and looked up at her with an expression that she found she wanted to keep, the simple pride of someone watching someone they love be recognized for what they actually are. "You should be pleased," he said. "I'm embarrassed," she said. "That's not the same as undeserved," he said. She sat down across from him and stole the paper and read it again, and he watched her with that particular quality of attention she had always loved in him, the way he was fully present when he looked at her, as though she was the most interesting and worthwhile thing in his immediate field of vision, which she had never entirely gotten used to and did not want to get used to, because the getting used to it would mean the stopping noticing, and she never wanted to stop noticing. In the summer of 1895, on a late July evening when the light came golden and long across the meadow, and the cattle were quiet, and the garden was at its height, Rose and Levi sat on the front porch together after the children had gone inside. She had her coffee and he had his, and Wheeler was gone by then. He had died old and peacefully in his sleep 2 winters prior, curled on his blanket by the stove, which was how they had all hoped he would go, but Sage was there, gray-muzzled now and slower, lying at their feet with the complete satisfaction of an animal that has had an excellent life. The last of the daylight was on Levi's face, and Rose was looking at it without pretending not to, as she had long since given up pretending not to do, and he turned and saw her looking and smiled. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers in the easy, familiar way of people who have spent years finding each other's hands without looking. And they sat there in the fading light with the prairie spread around them and the river they could hear but not see, and the house behind them full of the quiet sounds of their children and their life. She thought about the paper in her mother's Bible upstairs, paid in full, released. The words had meant one thing that April morning on the porch in Caldwell, the end of a debt, the literal release of a legal obligation, the beginning of a walk in an unknown direction. They meant something different now, 17 years later, the meaning having grown and changed the way real things do. To be released was not, it turned out, simply to be freed from something. It was to be given back to yourself completely, to have all the space and all the time and all the choices that a life requires, and to discover that you knew what to do with them. She had walked away that morning in whatever direction she liked, and the direction had led her here, to this porch, this hand, this light, this man who had held out a piece of paper and changed everything with the simplest and most uncomplicated act of decency. She thought sometimes about what had made him do it, not the full explanation he'd given her, his mother's story, the deputy's account, but the simpler thing underneath it, the quality of a man who could not pass an injustice if he had the means to address it, who did not look through people but at them, who held his hat against his chest when he spoke to a girl with a broom on a porch and treated her like a person before he knew anything about her at all. She had loved him for a long time now, with a love that had started as something tentative and wondering, and had become something else entirely, something that was woven through the texture of daily life, that was in the coffee cups and the evening conversations, and the arguments about cattle prices and the specific quality of silence they could sit in together for an hour and be entirely comfortable. And that was also, still, unmistakably, the thing it had been from the beginning, an astonishment. She was still sometimes astonished to be here, still sometimes astonished to be known this fully by someone and to know him back in the same way, to have built something real and lasting and entirely chosen from the ground up. "Levi," she said, "I'm glad you came into Caldwell that Tuesday." He looked at her, the hazel eyes unchanged. "So am I," he said, "every day since." Sage shifted at their feet with a contented sigh. In the east, the first stars were becoming visible as the sky deepened from gold to purple to the enormous, particular dark of a Kansas night, crowded with light that went back farther than anyone could properly understand. They sat there together until the stars were full, and the night was warm, and the children's voices from inside the house were comfortable and unhurried, and the land went on around them in all directions, theirs and tended and alive. And the river at its eastern edge ran on the way it always had, cold and clear and indifferent to history, but generous with its water, giving the meadow what it needed to be green, giving the cattle what they needed to be fat, giving the cottonwoods what they needed to be golden in autumn, and giving this house and this life and these 2 people what they needed to be, simply, undeniably, and without the shadow of a doubt, home.